Now we are moving on to our next speaker. We are going to hear from the Shakespearean Authorship Trust's Director of Research, Dr. Ros Barber, well known as author and as general intellect and, of course, a force of nature. We all recognize that. Now, Ros is a senior lecturer in creative and life writing at Goldsmiths University, London. She's published widely, of course, in the fields of authorship attribution, early modern literary biography, and indeed the Shakespeare authorship question, author of the Marlowe Papers, a novel-length poem that had such an impact, and also author of Shakespeare, the Evidence, and author and presenter of the Coursera massive online open course, Introduction to Who Wrote Shakespeare. And we're going to have a very interesting talk now from Ros that really is looking at a specific item of source material in her talk, Sources, Parallelism, and Problems with the Thomas North Attributions. Ros, over to you.
So I'm going to rattle on, gallop very, very quickly through this: sources, parallelisms, and some problems with the Thomas North attribution. Before I get going, I want to mention up front that I'm going to talk about EBO, and we academics often forget terms that we use all the time are alien to others. EBO is Early English Books Online, which is a digitized collection of printed works in English from the 15th through to the 18th centuries. However, it doesn't include foreign language texts or Latin ones, although Latin was the main language educated people read and wrote in. And it obviously doesn't include texts that haven't survived. Many texts have also been garbled in places by optical character recognition. And I have to say, nowadays, the search function is no longer fit for purpose, unfortunately. It doesn't work as well as it used to. The case for Thomas North has had some strong publicity in the last couple of years. Dennis McCarthy argues not that Shakespeare didn't write the plays attributed to him, but that he adapted them from the plays of a single author. His premise is that Sir Thomas North wrote the original plays on which the whole Shakespeare canon was based, except for The Merry Wives of Windsor and Two Noble Kinsmen. Our external evidence for North being a playwright is limited, but this isn't really very surprising. Whole bodies of work no longer exist. We have not a single play, for example, by Thomas Watson, despite his employer, William Cornwallis, saying that devising 20 fictions and knaveries in a play was Watson's daily practice and his living. And Francis Mears counted him among our best for tragedy. So the fact that we don't have any plays by Thomas North isn't itself any kind of proof that he wasn't a playwright. McCarthy argues that North began writing plays in 1555, although I haven't seen enough evidence of this to be persuaded. But in 1560, Jasper Hayward urges North and other members of the Inns of Court to do as he has done and translate Senecan tragedies. The others mentioned apparently obliged, and McCarthy argues that North did too. McCarthy says that North became master of the revels at Lincoln's Inn, meaning he would have been responsible for ensuring there was entertainment, including drama. Although I haven't seen evidence for this, and McCarthy makes a few unsupported assertions, such as North's first love was playwriting. Whether North wrote any of the entertainments at the Inns of Court, we really can't say. It seems possible that Thomas North did write at least one play for Leicester's Men, although, of course, none have survived. His brother, Roger North, who was very close to the Earl of Leicester, apparently made a payment to him at playwrights' rates at the same time as paying the company the standard rate for a performance at court. McCarthy gives examples of other playwrights being paid exactly these two amounts, so £6, 13 shillings and 4p, and then a payment of £3, 6 shillings and 8p. So there does seem to be something in that. I can't help feeling that McCarthy's note here, North's Theatre Company, is a bit of a stretch. His brother and Leicester were close, but Leicester's men were Leicester's men. McCarthy has published a peer-reviewed article proposing Thomas North as the author of a Shakespeare original. In 2014, McCarthy, along with June Schluter, published an article in Shakespeare Survey arguing that in 1562, Thomas North wrote Titus and Vespasian, a play that no longer exists, but it could be a forerunner of Titus Andronicus. They argued this on a number of grounds, including parallel phrases in Titus Andronicus that were also in North's only published work at that time, Dial of Princes. However, even if we were sure that Thomas North wrote Titus and Vespasian, which doesn't exist, we would obviously need to show that he wrote all the other original plays that also don't exist. There are two methods of going about this. One is sort of parallels with the life, which in Shakespeare's plays, which is rife with problems because, you know, you are subject to confirmation bias. I mean, it's not difficult to see a proposed author's biography reflected in Shakespeare's works, and it has been done for several of the candidates. As for looking for parallel phrases in the Shakespeare plays, this is a very problematic attribution method, as we'll see. So internal evidence for Thomas North as a playwright chiefly comes from the 4 published translations that he produced. The most famous one, Plutarch's Lives, a known source for Shakespeare's Roman plays. But searching for parallel phrases in Ebo comes with problems. Even the Shakespeare Survey article on Titus and Vespasian highlights problems with phrase searching on Ebo. There is a mention of the phrase to blush like a black dog. Ebo showed this only occurred in one other 16th century work besides Titus Andronicus and a North translation. So the authors took it as a North original, but R.W. Dent has it listed in his book from the 1980s as a proverb used in other sources as early as 1579. Ebo missed all but one of these. In addition to published sources, McCarthy and Schluter have mined an unpublished source, Thomas North's travel journal from 1555, to find parallelisms there. Unpublished at the time, obviously now it is published because they've published it. When considering parallel phrases, the context of the time is really important. What we now think of as plagiarism was then considered an essential part of the creative process. A humanist classical education positively encouraged translation and imitation, as the publishers of Harold Ogden White's book on the subject stressed. Writers of the period triumphantly applied the classical doctrine that originality of real worth is to be achieved only through creative imitation, and there was a great deal of borrowing at the time. So this is the context in which McCarthy finds Thomas North in the Shakespeare plays. I'm going to look at them in the same groupings that were in a document that McCarthy sent me. The first section is 200 examples where Shakespeare's phrasing seems to come from North. And the second section is what he calls the smoking gun section. There's 4, 5, and 6 there. Let's make it clear, it has long been known that Shakespeare plagiarized Thomas North's work, his Plutarch's Lives in particular. What McCarthy has revealed is that he seemingly plagiarized other North's works too. As a scholar with a wider focus, I'm aware that Shakespeare plagiarized lots of writers, stole, borrowed, whatever, some of them very thoroughly. But let's focus on what plagiarism is. Yes, it was fashionable, even encouraged as a sort of a technique for writing in the Elizabethan era. But of course, it isn't itself evidence of authorship. I've cooked up some symbols for various things that aren't valid evidence for authorship, and this is just the first, just to make it easier as I whiz through the slides. Also not evidence for authorship or indeed plagiarism are common rhetorical pairings, so rich and poor, nobleman and servant, husband and wife, any of these things appearing together. Words that are frequently grouped together, which are, as we now say, in the same semantic field, are not evidence for authorship or indeed plagiarism. And if there's a common earlier source that could have informed both of the texts, that's not evidence of authorship or plagiarism either. And when there's something specific you've got to describe, like a procession of cardinals, for example, then there are just words that are going to be necessary, which the writer won't be able to avoid, nouns especially, like cardinal and mitre. So this isn't evidence of authorship or plagiarism either. So those are my categories that I'm going to use looking at this work critically, and you could potentially add others. So let's take one of the examples billed as Shakespeare borrowing from North, this famous passage from Othello about being robbed of your good name. You see it in red there. Does it suggest that North wrote an early version of Othello, which Shakespeare adapted? Well, no on 3 counts. First, North's style is a published text, and Shakespeare can just steal the idea without North's intervention. But he didn't need to, because there is an earlier source. I found it in a text by Erasmus, published in 1534. And as for the pairing of rich and poor, well, that's a standard rhetorical pairing. I looked at all 20 of the passages McCarthy calls Shakespeare borrowing from North, and several of them have these earlier precedents. But all of them rely on North's works that were published by the time Shakespeare was writing the plays. So you can put it down to standard Elizabethan plagiarism rather than, Shakespeare adapting some North plays we don't have text for. I mean, I say plagiarism, retentive memory, a commonplace book, or sitting there with it open. Secondly, I looked at McCarthy's claim of 100 rare or unique verbal parallels. Again, I found plenty that weren't either rare or unique as claimed, but the fact is that 96 of the 100 were from North's published translations, so they can just be put down to the normal creative practice at the time. What I focused on were the 4 from North's Nepo's Lives, which wasn't published until 1602, but apparently borrowed earlier. So that's interesting to me. Here are the 4. They all appeared in Henry IV and Henry VI plays. So let's look at them one by one. Sallying a town rashly was something that military commanders might be prone to do. I found an example in Sir Walter Raleigh's huge History of the World, although he didn't publish that until 1614. It was 1 million words long, and no doubt sections of that were circulating in manuscript in previous decades. But the fact is, these words belong to the same semantic field. I don't find their use together particularly striking. Let's look at the phrase die 1,000 deaths, which Shakespeare has hyperbolized to die 100,000 deaths. I found rather a lot of matches for these words used together on Ebo, including die 10,000 deaths in the Henry IV section of Hall's Chronicles, which is a known source for Shakespeare's Henry IV. How about this section here in the third part of Henry VI about the kingdom and the crown and mine heirs? Well, obviously, these words are part of the same semantic field when kings are talking about succession, and also necessary words. I don't know what other words you're going to use for your kingdom and for your heirs. This is just plain speaking to my mind. So all we have left is within or in this earthly veil. And the fact is that earthly veil is a common enough conception at the time. I found several 16th century sources, a couple of them preceded by in. And in fact, the OED even mentions that this definition of veil is likely to be preceded by earthly. So to me, these claimed verbal parallels with the North text unpublished at the time are not compelling. How about the 80 Shakespeare passages plagiarized from North that McCarthy lists? Well, these are the known plunderings of Plutarch's Lives for the Roman plays, and there's nothing here to support the idea that there are some plays by North between one and the other. So let's get to the more interesting stuff then, the smoking gun section. McCarthy says that Shakespeare borrowed material from North's unpublished journal and begins with stage directions in Henry VIII, A Procession of Cardinals, which is why I mentioned it earlier. Yes, so there is this semantic field, there are necessary words being used with cardinals, etc. But McCarthy's very focused on the combination of after them and next them with in these 2 lists. Next them on its own, in fact, also after them, there's plenty of matches on Ebo. So it's the combination of after them and next them with. He says that after them within 30 characters of next them with only occurs in North's journal and in Henry VIII when searched on Google. But the texts digitized and searchable by Google are severely limited. And what you see here are not 16th century texts, but modern ones. And obviously, lots of that is not going to be available to Google, places where you might find those things. And I have to ask, really, how significant is that with? Because Herodotus, which it's very likely both North and Shakespeare read or could have read, had a lovely list of next thems and after thems. Seemingly, this came from Latin. So not unique then, possibly a common source, and the rest of the words are what I would call words necessary to describing a procession of cardinals. McCarthy, in fact, notes that North relied on two other texts to add what he calls knowing details to his journal entries, and I see no reason why they couldn't have been used by Shakespeare for exactly the same purpose. Here's another supposed borrowing from North's journal in The Taming of the Shrew. It involves some rural detail where Lombardy is compared to a garden. There are fat oxen and scores of milk kine to the pail, surely a distinctive phrase. The Lombardy one is from a common source. Apparently, it was an Italian saying that Lombardy is the garden of Italy, and John Florio's first and second fruits, both known Shakespeare sources, say Lombardy is the garden of the world. So Lombardy is a garden, not original. Milk kine to the pail, certainly a distinctive phrase, but it is actually not from the journal. It's published in Norse Plutarch rather than coming from there. So we know that Shakespeare plundered that. The phrase fat oxen is used all over the place, beginning with the Bible. And in this manner, I found that all the claimed borrowings from the journal appear to dissolve, unless there's some that I don't know about. What about the claim that Shakespeare used material from Nepo's lives before North published it? Well, for a start, the Latin original was available to the author, potentially. It's clear that Shakespeare had much more Latin than Johnson suggested. But what about this phrase, dissolve the bands of life? McCarthy says that the common source cannot be Simon Goulard's French translation from which North was working, because dissolve and bands are his own unusual word choices. I don't know enough Latin, or know any Latin, I went to a comprehensive. I don't know any Latin to be able to consider whether the original Latin is the source here. We mustn't rule out the idea that North's Nepo's Lives was circulated in manuscript, as that was such a common practice. I would say this one deserves some deeper analysis, but it's a very slender thing to suggest as evidence for a phantom North version of Richard II. Finally, McCarthy looks at some of North's marginalia. This I found really fascinating. In March 1591, North bought a copy of his own Dial of Princes from 1582, and he signs and dates it. And then he adds marginalia in various places, including the table of contents, which is a kind of an odd place to add marginalia. And this marginalia can be linked to passages in The Taming of the Shrew, Arden of Faversham, which is considered at least part Shakespeare at the moment, and Romeo and Juliet. Arden of Faversham has a fascinating connection to North's family. Alice Arden, who murdered her husband, as depicted in the play, was North's half-sister. The murder happened when Thomas North was 16 years old. And it's tempting to consider that North would have written about this family event, but McCarthy does just treat it as if it was true, which I always find a little suspect. However, why would North have needed to resort to Holinshead, which is known to be a source of that play? Arden of Faversham even reproduces one of the errors in the source, I believe. Also note that Arden isn't established Shakespeare play, so there are more authorship attributions to contend with, which complicates things. But in his marginalia on Dial of Princes, this is a striking parallel. Arden has a subtitle. The play has a subtitle that's very close to a chapter subtitle in Dial of Princes. There is some light plagiarism here of the standard Shakespearean sort, and some more here. McCarthy claims that this phrase, man is so very a fool, is uniquely shared between Dial and the Shrew. But with man replaced by various pronouns, that phrase has several earlier sources, including elsewhere in Holinshead. The problem is simply this: Dial of Princes was published and Shakespeare was a plunderer. McCarthy has linked North's marginalia to these three plays, all of which might very easily have been on stage at exactly the time that North bought and dated his copy of the Dial. So is North, as McCarthy claims, making notes on his published Dial with respect to revisions he is planning to make to plays he wrote years earlier? Or is North noting how passages of his may have influenced the plays of Shakespeare? In modern times, you might do this in preparation for a court case, but in the Elizabethan era, North might well have been congratulating himself on becoming a writer of influence whose words, like those of classical authors, were considered good enough to steal. In short, I think some aspects of the North case are really interesting, particularly the marginalia and his family connection to the story depicted in Arden of Faversham. And McCarthy makes a decent case for North having tried his hand at playwriting at least once, but it seems to me there's quite a lot of unevidenced assertion and overreaching. Claimed parallels between North's life story and Shakespeare's are not stronger than those I've seen with certain other candidates. Parallels in the text don't make good evidence, especially where what's being echoed or borrowed is in the public domain. You will know perhaps that Shakespeare ripped Marlowe off relentlessly, and that Calvin Hoffman's case for Marlowe's authorship of the canon was underpinned on a substantial number of parallels, many with the same issues that we see here. Alex Jack mined yet more parallels with the Marlowe canon just in Hamlet and filled 16 pages with them. And Donna Murphy filled an entire book with parallels between Marlowe's texts and early Shakespeare plays and apocryphal plays, using EBO with the exact same near matches method that McCarthy has used. I think the difference is that whereas Marlowe was an acknowledged master of blank verse drama, and we can at least find some stylistic markers that Marlowe and Shakespeare share, with Thomas North, we have not a shred of his plays left to analyse. And if all of these parallels noted even by orthodox scholars are not taken as evidence of Marlowe's authorship of the plays, then why would North's be? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ros. Fascinating stuff. Now, I don't know if you know that Dennis McCarthy is actually in the audience and has put quite a few comments in the chat. And, you know, rather than opening out a kind of debate there, as it were, I would hope, Dennis, that you know, you would accept that Ros has not done a hatchet job here. She has looked at your work and has researched it respectfully. And indeed, you know, this is the way knowledge moves forward, isn't it? That you publish yours, a rebuttal comes, you rebut the rebuttal. And so we move forward in terms of knowledge. So hopefully you will accept that. Ros, you may want to go into the chat afterwards and have a chat, literally, with Dennis McCarthy. However, he did, there was one, he put it in the chat, so I've kind of, oh, there it is. Ros, can you respond to this? Not necessarily that you can. No one has ever juxtaposed a description of a procession of cardinals with the seating arrangements of a consistory, except North or Shakespeare. And Ros was unable to find anyone else who juxtaposed after them with, next them with. Have you got a response to that, Ros?
Yeah, my issue with the with is like really how important it is, because that whole after them, next them, it already existed in a previous text that Shakespeare could have seen, the Herodotus. So the only difference is that word with. It's quite a lot of weight to put on it. I just didn't find it extra. I mean, obviously, I spent some time doing this. I spent a few weeks, quite a lot of hours looking into this. It's a massive case. It's a huge amount of work that Dennis has done. I could only focus on certain areas, and I found, I mean, for example, some of the things that were meant to be rare, I found two that had come from Psalms. You know, it's like when you find biblical sources, you start going, well, you know, my sort of little radar starts beeping, and I'm thinking, yes, there were a few places where I thought that's quite unusual, but it's not so extraordinary that you can say that one has come from the other for sure. And you certainly can't say that the person who wrote them is the same person. And as for sort of considering that there's a whole body of plays that exist that we don't have, I mean, you know, it may be true, but you can't commit to that on such slender evidence, I don't think.
Right, okay. Dennis does put in the Q&A, I think in response to my comment, agreed. Great job, Ros. It was fair and interesting. An interesting observation, slightly tangential, but interesting anyway, from Roger Strickmatter. He says, I'd like to hear more about the uses and abuses of EBO. I think that's a fair point, isn't it, Ros? I mean, you at the beginning there, I mean, EBO, it was seen as something quite extraordinary when we first started using it, but naturally through time, we've become a little bit more suspicious of it, I suppose.
There were some, I mean, there are big problems in that because it is just English books online and obviously partial, and a lot of reading was being done in Latin. I don't have any Latin, and there's no searchable database of the Latin sources that they would have been exposed to. But my great sadness is actually that EBO is much worse than it was 10 years ago, because it was bought by JISC historical texts and they destroyed the proper search function. So things that I have recorded searches on the old EBO that came up with lots of hits that now come up with nothing, right? And the new, so you can do JISC historical text, you can't search that, it's garbage. There's a free version of EBO that you can search, and it also doesn't work properly. So the searches I've recorded 10 years ago, I can no longer find. Therefore, you know that I can put a search term in, and if it doesn't come up on EBO, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So therefore, I couldn't completely rule out, you know, that there's cardinals being compared with consistory courts. It could be there, could be on EBO, unfindable. It could be in Latin sources. So unfortunately, I use it to try, you know, and I use it with alongside other methods, trying to see whether things really are rare, but you definitely can't make kind of firm predictions that these are unique matches, unfortunately, using EBO nowadays.
Yes, indeed. Okay, Ros. Well, there's another interesting paper to write, no doubt. Now, listen, thanks ever so much, Ros, for that really interesting analysis of Dennis McCarthy's work. And thank you, Dennis, both for coming along this evening and for your very fair and collegial interaction there on the chat and the Q&A. And I'm sure Ros will follow up with you on that.